will be presented by our own board member, Dan McClure, who just happens to be the brother of our presenter, Dr. William McClure. So in just a few minutes, we will have the presentation. If I can have Dan McClure come up and make the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hi, I'm Dan McClure. I have the pleasure to introduce my guest speaker today, who happens to be my
Stand closer to
older
the
brother.
microphone.
My older brother, plastic surgeon Dr. William McClure. He's practiced in California's Napa Valley since 1984, but he's also a part-time resident here in Coronado. He completed plastic and general surgery training at the Stanford School of Medicine and graduated medical school from UC San Diego. So over the last 40 years, he has dedicated himself to volunteer work, both home and abroad. He's led and served on more than 98 volunteer missions to low-income countries around the world to treat children with debilitating deformities, and also to teach advanced surgical techniques. His service and teaching trips have taken him to 16 countries on 5 continents. This summer's trip to Guatemala will be his 99th. In 2005, he was recognized by the Dalai Lama as an unsung hero of compassion. That's pretty good there. This journey began during his 3rd year of medical school. He was invited to join a group of UC San Diego plastic surgeons on a volunteer mission to Mexico to treat hair lips, cleft palates, burn scar deformities. He assisted the plastic surgeons who performed life-changing operations on children who otherwise would have had a normal childhood with all these deformities. The mission impacted his life so much that he decided at that moment to pursue a career in plastic surgery. So he can continue this work around the world. Before I introduce him, I'd like to give a shout out to our mother, Shirley McClure, back here. Voice speaking. Anyway, I'd like to introduce my brother, Dr. William McClure.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We wanted to show you a few things first. We came to Coronado in 1955. Some of you may remember these pictures. My father and mother, he was both had sea duty and shore duty back in 1955. Our little brother was born in 1957 here at Coronado Hospital. So what is plastic surgery and why did I choose this specialty? Do we use plastic? Well, I get asked that. Plastic is from the Greek word plastikos, which means to shape or to mold. And we took on that term plastic after the First World War, where modern plastic surgery had its beginning. Because of the horrible nature of trench warfare, Great Britain, for instance, had 35,000 war survivors with horrible facial deformities, sticking their heads up out of a trench, and the surgeons realized we need a way to take care of these people, and we coined the term plastic, again, which means shaping or molding. I'll just read this. Your reconstructive surgery, also known as plastic surgery, is our surgical specialty, which we focus on restoring both form and function of body structures. We reconstruct facial and body defects due to birth disorders, trauma, or illnesses. And I'll show you some examples. So as my brother mentioned, it was back at UC San Diego, a trip to Mexicali with the surgeons. And this would be a typical case. This is a bilateral cleft lip. And literally an hour and a half later, you can end up with this. And I realized this is in just a short period of time, you could change a child's life. This is on the operating room table. And so I decided I wanted to pursue this. I was accepted in the Stanford training program, which was my first choice because they had a program that included international reconstructive surgery. So I was there for 7 years. Now, what is the scope of the problem? Well, the major problem in the world is no access to surgery. And when we think about the needs, the health needs in low-income countries, we think of things like malaria, AIDS, tuberculosis. But in actuality, the 30% of the global health disease is due to surgical conditions. Now think of those of you who've had your appendix out, children who've had their tonsils out, women who've had C-sections. In low-income countries where these surgeries aren't available, these patients die. And this is something that is readily treated by surgery. And really, we recognize how important surgery is. And here's the statistics: 17 million people die annually because they don't have access to surgery. So 5 billion people, our world population now is 12 billion. Also, as far as reconstructive surgery, the thing that my colleagues and I do, we have one reconstructive surgeon for 50,000 people. San Diego has probably 60 plastic surgeons doing cosmetic surgery for our population, but throughout the world, there's one reconstructive surgeon for 10 million people. Now, cosmetic surgery pays the rent. This is my day job at home, and cosmetic surgery is fun. It is a part of reconstructive surgery. We do change people's lives. We make them happy, and many of my cosmetic surgery patients, they'll give me a statement like, "You must. How do you feel doing this quote frivolous operation on me when you're doing all this overseas work?" Well, I don't see it as frivolous. It's challenging. It's fun surgery. Patients are happy, and many of my patients have actually donated to the organizations that I work with. And also, without cosmetic surgery, I would not be able to do the overseas work because this is elective. I can schedule my cases, so these are just some of the typical things that we do. Now, throughout the world, we have beautiful children, and I've had you can read, these are children from different countries, and obviously everyone loves their children. So these are some of the countries that I visited since the early 80s. Some are a little more inaccessible than others. This is Bhutan, but again, beautiful children throughout the world. The problem is, not every child is born beautiful. And I can show you our patients. So you can see these children. This is Vietnam back in the late 80s, but all of these kids are in clinic waiting to have their cleft lips treated. Now, we have cleft lips and cleft palates in this country. 1 out of every 850 children are born with a cleft deformity. But in our country, the cleft lip is repaired by the time the child is 9 weeks old. So you don't see a lot of baby pictures of children with cleft lips, let alone toddlers with cleft lips, school-age children with cleft lips, or adults with cleft lips. Now, my dad used to say, he grew up in southern Missouri. He said back in the day, he remembers his parents talking about kids in elementary school that had cleft lips that were unrepaired. But we don't see that. We don't see that at all in the developing world. So one of the type patients we treat, we've seen, and I'll go through these. These are children with cleft lips, and what it is, and this is a cleft palate, the roof of the mouth, and these are things that we repair routinely. Again, a handful of children in clinic waiting in line. This is it's not truly an accident of birth. It's during the development of the child in utero where the lip elements don't come together. It's because in utero, the lip starts out split and then it gradually joins, but this is a failure of, call a failure of union. Now, so these are, again, throughout the world, we see these, and again, you're noting that these are older children. These aren't infants. So to go through one's life this way it's extremely difficult. This defect does not affect intellect, it does not affect other bodily function, but with this cosmetic deformity, many of these children do not attend school. Some countries, because of superstition, the village blames the parent that the parent did something wrong. Some of these kids do not go out and join the workforce. So with an operation that can take anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours, you can change this person's life. And this is it's a sophisticated operation, but it's actually low tech. It does not require a lot of equipment like orthopedic surgery or neurosurgery or cardiac surgery. It's essentially a handful of instruments. The older children, we can do these operations under local anesthesia, like going to the dentist's office. And most important, which I'll get to, this is an operation you can readily train another surgeon. And because that's what we do. We do surgery, but our main thrust is to teach the local doctors how to do this. And I will go into this a little more. So these are our patients. Burns. Burns are endemic in low-income countries. And one, just because burn prevention is not sophisticated in low-income countries, but also and these are graphic pictures. Let me show you. So if you look at this young girl's elbow, when a burn destroys skin, and when the skin is destroyed, there's a wound. And the way a wound heals is by contraction. So in this case, she had a burn across the inner part of her elbow. So as that wound heals, it pulls the skin together, and in her case, it pulls the elbow up, and there's scar tissue keeping the elbow in this position so she can't extend it. And similarly on the hand, you can imagine, I've worked places high in the mountains where every home has a wood-burning stove, and you can imagine a child putting their hand on the stove. So if you burn the palm of the hand, as the wound heals, it pulls the digits down and they can't open. So when we talk about burn scar reconstruction, we're releasing the scar and putting skin grafts on the hand, and I'll show you some examples, but these are, and very sad, when a child suffers a burn on the neck, and if you picture a garment catching on fire and the flame goes up, it burns the lower part of the neck, and so you've got this raw area. So as it heals, it pulls the chin down, and in cases it can even, in her case, pull the lip down. So what we're doing with burn reconstruction is releasing the scar and putting grafts. Couple shown, and this is the same thing in the elbow, beneath the shoulder. This person cannot abduct the shoulder because of the burn scars. And then these are accidents of birth, and these kind of speak for themselves. Very common where the digits are like web toes, web fingers, and these are all duplicated digits. So these are all things that we can take care of as well. Web fingers. These are graphic. These are facial tumors like Elephant Man, the Broadway play. This is a young girl from Jamaica, a boy from Mexico, and these are benign growths. The children doesn't die. I mean, he can live to adulthood, but obviously extremely deforming. This is in Africa, Vietnam. And then hairy nevus. These are essentially moles that are dark, and they can cover large parts of the body. These all happen to be children in Vietnam. And then drooping eyelid, and we see, and these are children born lacking the muscle that opens the eye, and it can affect function and also the appearance. So these are the type of patients we take care of. But let me show you some before and after. So here's the cleft lip. before and after. This is a year after surgery. Again, this is a child at home. These bilateral cleft lips, the ones that have a cleft on both sides, when you see the post-op pictures, the nose looks pretty funny because we have to go back and fix the nose later. But as far as closing the lip, so again, you can see the before and after there. And these children, these pictures are taken just a few days after surgery. So these are so typical cleft lip cases, bilateral cleft lip. And as I said, in these low-income countries, we actually see, this is a teenager, we see teenagers and adults with this. Now, a young person like this whole operation is done under local anesthesia, just like going to the dentist office. Here's a middle-aged gentleman who had it done. This is kind of more of the same. I worked with an organization that did work in northern Laos, and they have they call them tribal people, but they're not Lao people ethnically, but they have the but just very interesting people. Their headdresses, and again another young man or a middle-aged man. So this is interesting. This is way up in northern Laos. This is a father and a son, because there is, there is a genetic component where it can be passed along in families. So he showed up in clinic, and I went ahead and was able to do the operation again just under local anesthesia, which was good because he had come from a long distance with his wife and child. And so here he is. We've just finished the operation. The operation was only about an hour, and he was very stoic. We did it. And then after surgery, I gave him a mask, and he drove himself another 3 hours to go home.
Wow.
I mentioned a child burning the palm of the hand, and you see child cannot open the hand, so we release the scar and put skin grafts on to return their function. So the child's not holding a fist. This is as far as the child can extend the fingers, and so we release the scar and put skin grafts to allow the child to open the hand. Just kind of more of the same. Before, after. This defect goes on to the wrist. So these are, and even for these big tumors, so this was the little girl from Jamaica. She actually came and lived with us for a few months because the hospital donated her care and the anesthesiologist donated his services. And so we were able to, we couldn't save the eye but here you can see wearing an eye patch, much less deforming. This teenager from northern Mexico, the Seventh-day Adventist group brought him up to Napa, and here he is immediately after surgery. And so here he is back in Mexico. These large cases are beyond the scope of what we can do in many of the countries, but for some of our patients, we have been able to not as much bring them back to the States. We used to bring children back to just in my town, Napa, routinely, but with sadly, with hospitals becoming more corporate driven, hospitals aren't as willing to do charity surgery. Now our hospitals run, one hospital by Catholic nuns, the other hospital by Seventh-day Adventists. Now they're owned by corporations and no more free surgery, but we are able to bring patients with difficult conditions to other countries where surgery is much less expensive. So I have a child with a burn on the neck. At Stanford, they said, we can do it, it would be $65,000. In Ecuador, we can get it done for $5,000. It's the same operation. And just some hand cases here. Some before and afters. So here's this very deforming lesion. This is immediately after surgery. The mold has been removed, and we've taken skin from another part of the body to cover that. Now, on this child, I don't have a longer follow-up because I didn't go back to the same area, but this young girl had the exact same thing. So this is a year later, and this is all the skin we took from another part of her body. So we can make a big change. So this whole side, this all used to be all mold. So we replaced that skin. Another child, the same thing. This has all been replaced by skin graft. So here's the drooping eyelid. And here she is after surgery. So now she can open her eye. And just more of the same. Here's so here she is before surgery, and she just can't get that left eye up. So here she is. This is only one day after surgery. Kind of more of the same as right eye before surgery. This is after surgery. And he has it on both sides. And again, that's as far as he can open his eyes. Now, well, he wouldn't close them. And so he's had this since birth. So a little bit of bruising after surgery, but so these operations, especially in the adults, we can also do under local anesthesia. The children who have it done can go home the same day. So teaching is the key because you've seen this expression, because one surgeon in one lot. So in my lifetime, there's a finite number of operations I can do, but by teaching, we have a tremendous amount of leverage, because if I can teach our team, if our team can teach other surgeons how to do this operation, and they go on to teach other surgeons, we get this tremendous leverage effect. And really, surgeons in the low-income countries should be able to take care of their own patients eventually. And so here's this effect that we talk about. So say one surgeon could do 10,000 patients in their career. By training other surgeons who can then become trainers, and we actually did these calculations. So the people we teach can eventually leverage to 400,000 operations. And so that's the main thrust of what we do. There are many organizations that do international humanitarian surgery, and they're excellent organizations, especially the ones that do cleft lips, because it's easy to raise money for cleft lips because they're dramatic and show before and after pictures. You see late night television, you'll see people raising money. But the problem with a lot of these groups is a group of American team flies in, does a lot of surgery and leaves, and that's that. And there's a certain number of operations that have been done. More groups are now shifting to this model of teaching. And I consider my time valuable. And if I'm going to take time away from family and work to go on a trip, I want to make sure it's an organization that gives a big bang for the buck, an organization that can eventually do this leverage. And surgery, you can't teach surgery from a book. Just like becoming a mechanic or a pipe fitter, you have to learn on the job. And in fact, surgical training is like learning a professional skill. You go through an apprenticeship, then you become a journeyman, then you become the craftsman. in surgery, we have internship, residency, and eventually we're trained. So you teach surgery by doing surgery. And initially, your students will watch you, then they will do surgery under your supervision, and then gradually they will work independently. And you know, these are from quite a few years ago in Vietnam, but we talk about surgery, and that's actually the notebook that I'm talking to them about. Lectures, and we now in East Africa, the one group I work with has been tasked with doing all of the board certification for every plastic surgeon in, we call it East Africa, Central Africa, and South Africa. So we are doing all the education for these surgeons and certifying them. Over the years, we've had the opportunity to bring surgeons from other countries home, and we've actually hosted them in our house. Here's a, well, these are all surgeons that live with our house, and now, just an interesting story. This is when I first went to Vietnam in 1989, and you see this young surgeon here. He was a resident in training. There he is again, and keep your eye on this guy too. So this is Dr. Yuan, and he did his first cleft with us in 1990. His first cleft lip operation was 1990. He was inspired to become a plastic surgeon, just like I was. And here he is 25 years later. I told him, I said, "You look like an old man now." And he said, "Well, so do you." But now, he is from Saigon, but we're working in Quang Ngai because once he learned how to do the operation, he eventually became a professor, and he began leading trips to other parts of the country. So that's the whole goal. The people we teach, we want them to become teachers. And we're also teaching them how to take their skills and help others. So here we're working in Quang Ngai province. Here we are in a clinic together. So we've had the opportunity to work 3 times together, not in Saigon. Saigon does not need any more plastic surgeons, or their patients are all taken care of. So we're out in the provinces now working. He will have a case with a question, and he'll text me and send me a picture. And this is just some communication. And I can draw in the picture, send it back, and he'll do the operation and then send me the result. And so, we're doing this right now with surgeons in East Africa, and I used to say Central America and South America, but the level of training has advanced so much in Central, South America, Mexico, that really these surgeons in those countries are now doing their own outreach. So now we're looking, and same with places like Vietnam, they've learned so quickly. So now our big focus has been Central Africa and East Africa, and that's where I've been spending more time. So here, these are both full surgeons now, and these are 2 that I met back in 1989 when they were residents. Same thing, other countries with Nicaragua, Peru. Again, these are young surgeons who we started training. Cuba. I'll just go through this quickly, but the reason children get these horrible burn scar contractures in low-income countries, but not in our country, is because we have burn units. And to keep a scar contracture from forming, when we have a fresh burn, we resuscitate the victim, but then we take away the dead skin and immediately replace it with skin grafts so we don't get those contractions. But you need a burn unit, and this was the burn unit in Vietnam in 1989. And these are horrible pictures, but it was an impoverished country. This was their burn unit, but there was a tremendous need. So part of what we did was help them establish burn units, train the doctors, but also help them equip. So this is back in the late 80s. Our burn unit. This burn surgeon we brought to the United States and also sent her to Australia for training. We train nurses. Here she is at Stanford, that same doctor getting some training. and this is 2005, so this is 20 years ago, but the difference between from 1989 to 2005. So with a burn unit, we can avoid, we can help those patients to help them to prevent them from getting the contractures. Again, just a few years difference. Here's some of the staff back in '89, and here I visited in 2005, and still working, still, I think they have the same sign there. This is just a quick travel log. I'm gonna go through quickly, and then I'll get to the juicy part. The strange bedfellows you meet during this work. So these are different countries I visited, different places in Vietnam. And I had an interest in Vietnam because our father had 2 tours there, and this was in '67. This was in Saigon, and he came back, had some pictures. And when I went in 1989, I compared the pictures that I took in '89 with his memories from 1967, and he said, it had not changed much. I mean, Saigon had not changed, and again, I'll just go through some of these different countries. More recently, Vietnam has become a training center. So when I mentioned that we can't really bring children to our country anymore, it's too expensive, and also a visiting surgeon can't come in the operating and do surgery. And to learn surgery, you have to do it, whereas we have a training center in Vietnam, a training center in Nepal, where, say, a doctor from East Africa can go to Nepal and actually do burn surgery. And so the training is much more efficient in these other countries. So that's where we're putting our interest. And Hue, Vietnam has become a training center. So we'll be sending doctors from Laos, Cambodia, poorer parts of Vietnam to Hue to be trained. Some countries that not many people get to, Bhutan. This is the flight to Bhutan. You pass by. Bhutan has the most dangerous airport in the world to land because there aren't many flat areas to land a plane. And the only pilots that can land there are Bhutanese pilots who have learned the system. This is our team with this beautiful backdrop. It's a small country. This is the new king, who's kind of like a rock star in Asia. And he was, here he is here. He was very supportive to, this is one year, this is the following year. And I mentioned we now have a bigger interest in Africa. This is Burundi and Central Africa, where I've been going every year, and we'll go again this September. Tiny country. And again, just like Vietnam back in the 80s, in Vietnam now you don't see teenagers with cleft lips, because just like in our country, the children are treated before they're, even before they get their baby pictures. But here in East Africa, this is like Vietnam 40 years ago. And teenagers awaiting surgery. Cambodia, Colombia, countries throughout Latin America. It's different now because Latin America has very skilled plastic surgeons in every country. And so our trips to these countries, we are working in conjunction with these surgeons, taking care of their poor people. So, and that was Cuba. I could spend a whole lecture on Cuba, but I first started going there in 2004, and there have been major ups and downs, and that's why I wanted to spend the last part of this talk on the weird politics of doing this work. So I worked in a few places in Cuba. Did not get a chance to meet Castro, but I'll talk about that. Again, Latin America has many, many skilled surgeons, and interestingly, back in '81, this was my wife in '81, our honeymoon was in Ecuador. The timing I was invited to go on a trip, and the trip was to leave the day after our wedding. And I said, well, I can't go because I'm getting married. And my wife, Chris, is a nurse, and the team said, well, bring her. She said yes, so this was our honeymoon. Guatemala, that's where I'm going this summer. Guatemala, I've been going to every year. Honduras. Unfortunately, San Pedro Sula, for a 2-year period, became the murder capital, not only of Latin America, but of the whole world. There were more murders per capita in San Pedro Sula than there were in Syria. Again, sad. Politics used to be the big issue. Now it's not politics, now it's crime. And San Pedro Sula, I guess, became a big transit area where you could bribe officials and transfer drugs. They're still high, but they're not as high as they were. And this is Chris and I working in Honduras. Northern India, the Chinese have denied Tibet the right to have their own country. The Dalai Lama lives in exile in northern India, and this is where he lives, and he gives audiences there. But we take care of a lot of Tibetan children who come to India for treatment. And had a chance to meet him back in '96. Laos, again, another communist country. I work with an organization that does this work way up in northern Laos, which is kind of a crazy area because you've got Thailand, China, Laos, and the hills of Vietnam. Historians, Dien Bien Phu is right there up in the mountains. And but the issue there is they grow all the opium there. It's the golden triangle. And again, kind of weird politics. I don't want to rag on the Chinese very much, but the Chinese have completely exploited this area. The Mekong River starts up in northern Laos, comes all the way down through Cambodia into Vietnam. The Chinese are building unbelievably gigantic dams here, which will decimate all the mountain people, and they will move to the city. And China's able to do that because they want the power. 80% of the power will go into China, 20% will go to Laos. But the reason they can do that is because the Lao government, they get paid off, and so they're going to build this gigantic dam. Of course, Cambodia and Vietnam are trying to fight it, but this is working in northern Laos. These are these tribal people that live up in the mountains, and these people will all, if they lose the river, they will have to all go to the city. Madagascar, another kind of crazy place that I had a chance to go, and as I said, Mexico has extremely high level of plastic surgery, and so my missions to Guanajuato, which is a very nice town right near San Miguel de Allende, what we're doing here is there are surgeons from Mexico City, from Morelia, from Guadalajara, and I'm from California. I bring a resident from Stanford where I'm affiliated. Each of these doctors bring their residents, and we go to Guanajuato to take care of the poor children there that can't get surgery. So here, the group, all these young doctors are Mexican residents in training from these different countries, along with their professors. And here's my resident from Stanford. And so every year, the Stanford resident gets to work with his or her counterparts in other countries, young Mexican residents. All the Mexican young doctors look like they're from a novella. They look like soap opera stars. They're every resident I bring down from Stanford, they say, we're all Slavs. They're all so good looking down there. Peru. So I'm skipping through this because I want to get to the Philippines. And I've shown pictures of some other organizations I work with. Any of you who are Rotarians, the Rotarians have this wonderful group called Rotoplast. And they work in many different countries through the local Rotary organizations. So this team, for instance, was from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and from Vancouver, and we worked with the local Rotary Club in Cebu, Philippines. We worked with the local Rotary Club. I'm not a Rotarian, but I volunteer for their missions. And so again, it's sponsored by Rotary. So now just in the few minutes, I wanted to talk about the crazy politics, because when you think about it, healthcare should transcend politics, and in many ways it does. If you think back to the, I'm going to show my age, back to the 50s, 60s, this was the expression throughout Latin America, Yankee go home. No one wanted the Americans there. So this is one of my mentors back in the early 60s on the hospital ship Hope. And this was taken from the ship. And this was happened to be in Peru. And there was a tremendous amount of anti-American sentiment in Peru. A lot of it was fanned by the Communist Party in these countries. But you see, these people spontaneously brought out the American flag to welcome this American group. This is Gracias Hope, and this is the ship. So this was an example of, even though it was Yankee go home, it was Yankee go home, but you stay. And the one thing that's predominant throughout the low-income countries is that, teenagers with guns everywhere. Now, interesting politics. My first trip to Nicaragua, Anastasio Somoza was the dictator. My second trip, Daniel Ortega. And so there was the revolution, and Ortega came into power. He was the darling of the developing countries. He was like he was another Che Guevara, another Castro, and got a lot of support from Castro. Unfortunately, 40 years later, here's Daniel Ortega, who, guess what? He is now the dictator, and he is taking aid for himself. He's a very rich man, and it's just that sad cycle. It's the people that suffer, but the big revolution, and again, I won't go into Cuba, but that's Cuba, a lot of stories about Cuba, the same sort of thing. So, and Daniel Ortega is still in power. But here's the politics. This was a few years after the revolution. This is in Matagalpa, Nicaragua, which was one of the hotbeds of revolution. Just like in Cuba, all the Fidel Castro's men were all in the mountains on the east side of the country. Well, in Nicaragua during the revolution, all of these people, and many people were killed here. Growing a beard was a sign of being one of the rebels. Now the war's over, we end up working with a lot of these literally former, and many of the doctors were impressionable students at the university, because you had to be in university to become a physician, and many of them were influenced fought in the resistance. But now, so here, this is a group of Nicaraguan doctors, and well, the one with the beard was a former guerrilla. The other two were former military academy graduates. So interesting that we can get them to work together. And this was very tragic. Here, former guerrilla, he wasn't military, but he was from a very rich family. But able to work together to do this project. Now, the other sad thing is, I mentioned, in many of these countries, it's not politics, but it's just crime. He was tragically murdered just in a carjacking. One byproduct of the Nicaraguan revolution and then the Contra fighting that came is everyone has a weapon down there. And so this was just a street crime, and he was murdered. And that's the problem that a lot of volunteers face. It's not war or revolution, it's just the worry about kidnapping and crime. So I said I would talk about Cuba at another time. My first trip to the Philippines, Marcos was president. Second trip, Cory Aquino took over. The interesting thing here is I was working with the young doctors, and they were all anti-Marcos. And they took me to visit the university, and they were getting ready to do a protest, all these students. And I'm looking at them, and I remember when I was an undergrad at UCLA, there was a lot of the protests. And I'm looking at these students getting ready for a protest, and they're putting on the equivalent of bicycle helmets, they're padding their clothes.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, what's going on? And they said, oh, because they're gonna get beat up. So they knew if they were gonna demonstrate, they were all gonna get beat up, and they were prepared. Whereas I remember at UCLA, if someone got beat up, it was, how could they beat me up? I said, well, because that's what happens. In the Philippines, they're very realistic, and that was an eye-opener for me. And then, now, the next time I visited, they took me on a tour of Marcos's house, and I got to see all of Imelda Marcos's shoes. And so again, interesting politics, but and I mentioned I had a chance to meet the Dalai Lama. So this is a protest going on. The Tibetans routinely protest against the Chinese. And my host, I wanted to go out and take pictures. My host said, you know, probably don't go to the protest. I said, why? He says, well, you want to work in Tibet? I go, yes. He goes, well, there are people who'll take pictures of you and you can't go to Tibet because the Chinese won't let you. I'm thinking, that sounds crazy. I mean, you know, a picture of me, you know, but it was true. There was I found out later there was a group of physical therapists who work with Doctors Without Borders, and they were not at the protest. They just happened to be, they wanted to meet the Dalai Lama, and Chinese had agents there, and the word got back to Tibet, and they were booted out of the country because they said anyone who's going to deal with Tibetans in exile. So, you know, the politics can be brutal. And this is just local politics. These are Hmong. This is in Laos, and we have the Hmong population, which is a tribal group. We have a lot of Hmong immigrants here in this country. They were allied with American forces there, and so many of them were kind of forced to immigrate. So these are Hmong. The local hospital administrators wouldn't let them come in the hospital. We could operate on them, but they said they didn't want them to be in their beds. So we had to build a tent city outside. And we thought, we didn't think they were joking, but we thought, you can't be serious. And he said, no, they can have their surgery, spend one night in the recovery room, but then they can't stay in the hospital. So all my trips to Laos, if we're taking care of tribal people, we had to have a tent city outside where they cooked. And so again, crazy politics. Now, the last few minutes, I'll talk about Vietnam. This April will be the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. You know, hard to believe, it's been 50 years since 1975. So I had an interest in going to Vietnam, part of it from our father. And it was very difficult to get a visa to go to Vietnam, but there had been quite a few American doctors who had worked in Vietnam, including military doctors. And one thing led to another. I had to go to the Philippines because we did not have relations with Vietnam in 1989. And through the Vietnamese embassy consulate in Manila, waiting and waiting, I was finally able to get a visa to go in 1989, and there were not any Americans there. But this is 89. So this is a hardcore communist country that had been our enemies for more than 20 years. And people, and here you can see, welcome American friends. So people would ask me, well, when you worked in Vietnam, what was the feeling there? And I didn't really know what to expect, but the interesting thing was that we don't realize is, you know, we look at our own limited history, but if you think about 50 years ago, the fall of Saigon, and there's a famous picture of this tank knocking down the gate to the presidential palace. Many years later, a reporter had gone back and had actually found the tank commander whose tank had knocked down that fence, that gate, and he interviewed him. He said, I had not seen my family for 3 years. We've been fighting continuously, and all of a sudden the war is over, and we had never been so happy. They actually found the president's office, got his cigars and brandy. He said they got drunk, we smoked his cigars. It was the happiest day of my life. The next morning, his whole tank battalion was sent all the way to the Chinese border, and they immediately went to war with China. It was a war we don't even talk about, but in 2 provinces there was fighting between Vietnam and China. The day after the Americans left, yes, they did. Shortly after that, the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia. And for 10 years, from 79 to 89, Vietnamese fought in Cambodia. And all of the young doctors I worked with in Vietnam in 1989, their military service had all been in Cambodia. So for the Americans, we were 2 wars ago. And we came after the French War, and the French War came after the Japanese War, and they've been fighting China for 1,000 years. And the Vietnamese, like many of the Asian groups, are very pragmatic because, you know, we look at war and we think of atrocities and we just, it's a horrible, horrible thing. At least the people I talked to in Vietnam is, well, yes, war is horrible and horrible things are going to happen, but that's the past. We need to think about today, and the Vietnamese needed our help. And so I had very interesting, and this is the hospital situation in Vietnam when I was there in '89. This is a hospital, tons of patients who had not been treated. This is an operating room. This is a modern operating room. I'm going to skip ahead here. So when I got to Saigon, the doctors I work with, the older doctors were from the South. They all spoke French. They were educated in French language. They most of them served in the Southern forces in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And they were anti-communists. They served in the armed forces, which meant after the war they went to re-education camps. All of the administrators for every hospital came down from the north. So every administrator was a northerner, and the northerners who had administrator jobs were hardcore communists. They suffered tremendously during the war with the bombing, and not just the bombing, but just the deprivation, whereas the South was relatively spared, especially Saigon, where there was a booming economy going on during most of the war. So these doctors had to work together, but we also had Southern doctors who were communist sympathizers or outright Viet Cong. So it was an interesting mix. You had Northerners, Southerners, you had Southerners who allied with the Americans, you had Southerners who were Viet Cong. Everyone kind of got to work together, and I'm going to give you some examples in a moment, So for instance, I show you this picture. The young doctors had all served in Cambodia. Dr. Tri was the professor, and he was from a rich Southern family and was trained in France. And so here's Dr. Tri. She was a hospital administrator. She was from Hanoi, and she was very serious communist administrator. He was also from the north, a surgeon from the north. And so we're working together. Now, these are, we call them Siamese twins, conjoined twins. Dr. Tri was one of the country's experts in separating twins. And I met this very unassuming doctor in 1989, and his staff was telling me, oh, Dr. Tri is very famous. He separates twins. And I found that hard to believe when I saw the operating room and thinking, how could they do this in this low-tech setting? But he was famous, and sure enough, I think they could see the doubt in my face, and Dr. Tri mentioned something to one of the staff, and they took off. About a half an hour later, these 2 little kids showed up. Those are the twins he separated. So, and I was just blown away by Dr. Tri. And I have a moment for a quick story. So he was in a re-education camp, and while he was in the camp, he heard a rumor that the other famous surgeon in Vietnam who separates conjoined twins was also in the camp, Dr. Lau. And so Dr. Tri tells me the story. He says, so I went all throughout the camp looking for Dr. Lau. I kept saying, is Dr. Lau the famous surgeon here? And they go, oh, he was over there. So I go to the other side of the camp. I said, I'm looking for Dr. Lau, the famous pediatric surgeon. He goes, oh, he was just here. He's over there. So I go over there. Finally, I get over there, and there's a big hole. And I say, where's Dr. Lau, the famous pediatric surgeon? He says, well, he's down at the bottom of the ditch. And I look down, and there's a man digging. I said, are you Dr. Lau, the famous pediatric surgeon? He goes, no, I'm Dr. Lau, the famous ditch digger. But now the Vietnamese being very pragmatic, they realized, why do we have these people in re-education camp? We have a shortage of doctors, so all of the physicians were let out early after spending 5 or 6 years and worked very hard. Now, one of the most pragmatic surgeons was head of health services for all of Saigon, 9 million people. And he was a very dynamic man, very interesting man, very compassionate man, very dignified. And I would ask his staff, he said, well, what's Dr. Chung's story? He was always a very famous surgeon. He was a heart surgeon trained in Paris from a very rich family in the South. But Dr. Chung, while in Paris, met Ho Chi Minh and became an ardent communist. And so working in the South, I said, well, wait a minute, but he worked for the Americans. He goes, no, he is a spy. I go, what? He goes, he's a spy. I go, what? Spy. Oh, spy. He was a spy. He goes, oh yeah. He Viet Cong communist, but he also worked with Americans. And it was and his family suffered a lot, but he was a big hero, but he was a Southerner. And he was the one that realized we have to get all of these people out, out of re-education camp. And as a result, these surgeons were very loyal to Dr. Chung, even though 20 years ago, they were killing each other's families. But it was that pragmatism or that realization that we have to, help our children. Now, early on, every hospital had a scary guy like him. He would show up everywhere. No one would talk to him. Everyone ignored him. But he was always coming around to us. He wanted cigarettes mostly. And finally we said, well, who's this guy? And he was the CPV, Communist Party of Vietnam, which is the most, well, here it is. So every organization had someone like him. It was the best job. You didn't have to do any work. All you had to do was hang out and report on people. So everyone was afraid of him. No one wanted to talk in front of him, but every organization had a guy like him. But again, the Vietnamese being very pragmatic, they said, Dr. Bill, be very nice to him. When you go through duty free, bring him cigarettes and Johnny Walker, which I did. He became our best friend. And so going through customs is always tricky in many countries because you need to pay sometimes the poor guy and so we bring all of our supplies. We're stuck at the airport trying to get through, and the lower level bureaucrats, the immigration people customs people give us a very difficult time. So he shows up and snaps his finger and everything went through. So we had to be a little pragmatic but within a few years, they got rid of all these guys. So Dr. Tri came and lived with our family for 6 months while I was doing further training, and we employed him as a babysitter, as a cleaner. And one last story about weird politics. I had worked quite a bit in Vietnam. Not many Americans had gone there, and Primetime Live, it was an ABC show. They had called me and they wanted to do a story. And because it was difficult for foreign journalists to come to Vietnam, but having the connections through medicine, we were able to get the visas and smooth customs. So this Primetime Live team from New York City came with me to Quang Ngai province. And I thought, well, gee, these are the professionals. This is ABC News. They must have done their research because Quang Ngai province was extremely historic, especially for news people, because remember Morley Safer, 60 Minutes? His big break came in Quang Ngai. That was the Zippo lighter thing where he did a story of I think it was a soldier who had lit a hut on fire with a Zippo lighter. So that was Morley Safer was in Quang Ngai. Margaret Gellhorn, who was a correspondent, wrote a series of articles for the New Yorker called The Destruction of Quang Ngai in 1966, which actually got people to kind of think twice about Vietnam. So a lot happened in Quang Ngai. And I'm talking to the producer and the reporter on the way to Vietnam, and they had no idea of that. And I'm thinking, you didn't do your research? And then I mentioned, well, the My Lai massacre took place in Quang Ngai. And then they went crazy. They go, what? And you didn't. And now the whole thrust of the story, which my agreement was, they would do a story on how the Vietnamese are now taking care of their own. But now with My Lai and the history of Quang Ngai, then they start changing the whole story. Oh, and then to make it worse, I mentioned, we got to Da Nang and I mentioned, my dad was here. They go, why? He goes, well, he was in the Navy, he was stationed here. And then they said, oh, okay, now the story was gonna be, son returns to the site where his father fought to My Lai, and I don't know how they're twisting the story, and I wanted to tell him, when my dad went to Vietnam the second time, I asked him, I said, hey, Pop, any way you might get hurt? And he goes, yeah, if a typewriter falls on my foot. But the story was gonna be here, my 45-year-old father fighting in Da Nang. And then, I'll just finish up with this story, just to show you how crazy media can be. Then, we were unbelievably overwhelmed with children. And this was a Vietnamese team. The whole point of my story was these were the Vietnamese doctors we trained about 4 years earlier. And now they were leading their own mission. I was the only American on the team, and I was very proud of that. But then the whole story got to be about me. And not that I'm immodest, but it was not going to be the point of the story. And then, but we had so many patients, we were so overwhelmed. The producer and the reporter came to me, completely oblivious, and said, Bill, think you could take the afternoon off? And I thought they were joking. And I go, why? He says, we want to take pictures of you kind of walking on the beach, being contemplative. And I said, I thought they were joking. And the last thing is the doctor, our host doctor there, who was in his early 60s, was a very gracious man. And I got talking with him. Again, he was a surgeon during the war, worked with the Americans. At night, he worked with the Viet Cong in the tunnels. So every night he would go up and work in the tunnels. And I didn't tell this whole story to the ABC News, but finally on our day off, they did take us out to the My Lai Memorial, and they wanted this doctor and I to walk around the memorial grounds, contemplative. And now fortunately, the story never aired, and there's a lot of reasons for that, starting with O.J. Simpson and a lot of things that were bigger news. But it was just, but that one doctor, again, this was a doctor who suffered terribly, worked in the, but for taking care of children, they did all come together. So, so there's my dad, I don't know where his typewriter is, but, so I'm gonna stop there, and I think I ran out of questions.
We have just a few minutes for questions, including any Zoom questions you may have. Mike will go around with the microphone.
All right, Dave, being here first.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. That was really engaging and very interesting. Two things. One, it strikes me, the socio-cultural obstacles, particularly like in Bhutan or Northern Laos, how do you overcome those? And then also the operating room conditions, such as the operating room is, what concerns do you have doing these operations in a tent, for example?
A lot of concerns, but again, there's sophisticated operations, but low tech. And so not a lot of equipment needed. The instruments I can hold in my hand, a lot of things we can do under local anesthesia. And again, we can teach.
Next question, Kirk Henry.
Concerning communications, how many languages do you speak, and did you take translators with you to these countries?
I speak enough Spanish to talk to my patients, but yes, we definitely need translators. But the problem is in Northern Laos, they don't speak Lao, they speak different dialects. Even in Guatemala, they have their dialects, even Southern Mexico. So yes, translators.
Doctor, your next question is from a doctor.
Okay.
I just want to commend you on the work.
Oh, thank you.
You're modest, and I want the audience to know that when you take care of a child and you repair the deformity, you are taking care of the entire family. Because the
Yes.
family is very involved in that child, and they don't go to work, they don't go to school, and the whole village is involved. And that is something that people should know.
Yes.
Next question, Archie.
There seems to be a certain current move to limit or restrict foreign students from U.S. universities. Wouldn't that affect the progression of your medical training?
Yes, it does in many ways, because the side benefit of having foreign students work here is, they watch football, they make friends, they eat McDonald's, they eat tacos, and they realize, I kind of like America. And then when we go to their countries, we already have this bond, but we really we lose a lot of that. And a lot of other countries now offer their services to physicians for training, which is unfortunate. But they can still come here, it's just a lot more hoops to jump through.
Okay, since we ran over, this will be the final question.
This is, I guess, a yes/no question, but thank you for coming, first of all, but you and your team of people that you train have successfully duplicated yourselves so that some countries you no longer need to go to. Do you see a time in the future where there'll be enough people trained throughout the world that they'll all be trained and they can start training their own countrymen so that you don't have to go any longer?
Yes, that is exactly, yeah. So we no longer go to Mexico, we no longer go to Vietnam, I mean to work, yeah, that is the goal, thank you.
How many other areas do you have to go to yet that need to get trained?
Well, like I say, Central East Africa, they're the new big spot.
Right. Your lifetime?
Yeah. Well, half the world's population is going to be African by 2070. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So our next meeting will be April 25th, and we will have Admiral Charles Martolio speaking about the state of international affairs, which will be a fascinating discussion and presentation. So I'm sure you will not want to miss that. And again, thank you, Selena, for the mastering of the other visual presentation, which will be on YouTube sometime later next week. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. McClure. We really appreciate your presentation today. If you'll just stay for a minute.